Hey everybody, my name is Rich, and this is Rich Talks Records, episode number 53. And we're running up the mountain yet again. Today will be the Public Image Ltd. in 1981 video, and we will, of course, be discussing this album, their third album, 1981's The Great Flowers of Romance, in incredible detail, as well, of course, as the Ritz Riot that happened in, I think, May of that year, and we will be discussing kind of all points in between, as we do in these Public Image Ltd. videos. Not too much happened with Public Image Ltd. in January 1981. Over in New York, which will eventually become crucial to the Pill story, the airing at the kitchen of Paul Dougherty's. Was it Paul? It was. I think I might have said Pete in the last video. Uh-oh. Anyway, Paul Dougherty's The Pill Tape, which was the film from the Great Gildersleeve Show, made its premiere airing. And that's about it for January. This is really groundbreaking stuff. This is important. This is why you tune in. In February, The Pill Tape was shown at the Peppermint Lounge in New York. Moving on. So what was kind of happening behind the scenes with Public Image Ltd. at this point, back in England, was they were really fighting with Virgin Records. Pill had submitted The Flowers of Romance, and Virgin had determined that it was wildly uncommercial. And in the same way that they had fought over with Metal Box over how many copies to print, they again lost the battle, and I forget now, it was 20 or 30,000 copies for Britain, and then that was a wrap. So they also then were fighting with Warner Brothers in America. From what I understand, the raids on Lydon's house at Gunter Grove continued unabated. They were kind of public enemies number one, and that phenomenon really had not ebbed. In March 1981 is when Public Image Ltd. Finally released The Flowers of Romance. It finally was going to see the light of day. And so John and Keith did a round of press. Comparatively speaking, with the previous years, this was a very light year in terms of press. They promoted the album. They did one or two interviews post Ritz Riot. And that's kind of it. There's sort of a, if you will, a veil of secrecy over Public Image Ltd. At this time. So the first interview that they did, which was John Solo, was in Rolling Stone. It's a really cool interview. I'll be linking to all of these. As with the previous videos, the interviews are well worth reading. It's going to be an endless list of links as with what I've done before. And also, again, I will now say, none of this would be possible without fodderstomph.com. I've talked about that at length in other videos. Like, my admiration for their hard work and diligence is endless. I've talked about that elsewhere. We don't need to keep rehashing that one. So, at any rate, all this stuff basically is linked off of fodderstomph.com. There will be, two, I think, exceptions that I'll be touching upon later. So, at any rate, also in March, they do, Lydon and Levine do an interview with the NME, which is one of the most interesting interviews that they did, partially because the NME, far more than Rolling Stone was going to, the NME call them out on their lack of productivity. And this was at a time where the British press really, especially post-Wobble, Dave Crow's leaving weirdly got a lot of publicity. So this really kind of starts to turn the tide on Public Image Ltd. And I'm hopefully going to contextualize this a little bit more as I get into album talk. I sort of have a whole thing I want to get into that I haven't quite worked out exactly how I want to do it. But at any rate, they are what would have been sort of unthinkable in, like, let's say 1979. The reverence for them was starting to slip a little bit. Kind of like the reverence that some of the press had for the Pistols was starting to slip by the time they actually put out Nevermind the Bollocks and then went to tour in the US. And it's actually kind of surprising to see how they're kind of being poked at and made fun of a little bit and diminished a little bit. It's an interesting, like, turning of the tides, if you will. So there's that aspect. And Public Image Ltd are, I wouldn't say they're totally on their back heels, but they are having to answer for things in ways that they didn't have to even a year before, for instance. So one interesting thing, and I just had highlighted a couple things in some of these interviews, Keith is going out of his way to minimize wobble, and basically just says in several interviews from this time that wobble would just come in, lay down his bass lines, and leave. They make it sound as if the major point of contention with wobble was that he didn't stay for mixing sessions. I don't really, there's not much to that. Keith, this is a major talking point of Keith's. Interestingly, it is not a major talking point of John's. John still seems to, John still is giving compliments to wobble, whereas Keith acts as if wobble was really of no greater significance than a Jim Walker or a Richard Dudansky. So, interesting. The other thing that comes out at this time is we had the recording of Pied Piper in 1980, and with the three-person lineup. Well, Pill now is sort of officially a three-person lineup with Jeanette Lee. The other thing, and you'll have to forgive me, I just don't remember if I touched upon this before or not. I truly don't remember. But Dennis Morris also left in 1980. I think I mentioned that. But Dennis Morris, in his interview with FodderStomp.com, basically didn't like the direction they were going in artistically with the Flowers of Romance, and specifically mentioned that he had nothing to do with the artwork, whereas he had been strongly involved in the artwork before that. So, interesting. He sounds, as opposed to sort of the personality conflicts with Dave Crow, for instance, Dennis Morris, it appears to be more of an aesthetic disagreement. And I didn't really detect any bad blood in particular. Whereas Jeanette Lee, in further coming out into prominence in her role in Public Image Ltd. So, for instance, she's now in every publicity photo, right? Jeanette is now, like, I think it's Keith that says tatty things about Don Letts, for instance, that a lot of the film work that is purported to be Don Letts's is actually Jeanette's, and that Letts was heisting credit. Now, Don Letts has done a lot of work. I don't know how much truth there is to that. Who can really say? I don't know. There is and I guess we'll get into that later, but suffice to say, there is a startling lack of film and video output from Jeanette, where that was supposed to be her primary role. Though, speaking of roles, and this is where the morass of Pill in this time, we'll get into this. One of the other major talking points, and one of the things that they all hammer away at, is that there are no roles in the group. There, of course, are, because no one is singing other than John. No one is writing lyrics other than John. I mean, there are absolutely roles, but there is this sort of claiming of no roles. I tend to think that is part of de-emphasizing wobble's significance, and I also tend to think that is also, sonically with the Flowers of Romance, it's not just that they lose wobble, it's that Keith Levene barely plays guitar on the album. So I think part of the no roles thing also explains why Martin Atkins makes up such a huge amount of what you're actually hearing on the album, as well as the fact that Keith isn't playing guitar. If Keith isn't the guitar player because there are no roles, well, then he doesn't have to play the bloody guitar. Which, on one hand, Absolutely. Positive negativism. I'm with it. Like, right on. Don't let that hinder your exploration. Great. Cool. However, there does seem to be a lot of odd backtracking and attempts at what they would now call reclaiming the narrative over how Pill has gotten to this point. So there are claims of that the three-person lineup is the ultimate realization of what Public Image Ltd should have been from the beginning, for instance. That's an example. The other sort of part of this is, and Keith really ramps this up, and will next year when I do 82, 83, Keith really ramps this up. The whole "we're not a band" thing, so they are now off the road, they are not touring, there are no shows on the horizon, period, they're not a band. Keith really hammers away at, he wants Public Image Ltd to be thought of in this as Sony, and that the records are nothing but the communications front for the corporation. And he wants the talk of from the previous year, the later 1980 interviews, of trying to get grants from corporations and get funding from other corporations, and the sort of divesting away from Virgin so they can realize their ideas. Also, interesting, another thing that Keith brings up a lot, he had brought up in the 1980 press conference but in San Francisco, but also brings it up again here, the idea that they want to do away with film unions, and they want to be able to do film and video work without having to deal with unions. So that's another, I mean, Keith really goes on about this, and that seems to be the major thing on his mind at this time. So I had talked in the 1980 video about Richard Branson attempting to get John Lydon to join the Professionals or have some sort of Sex Pistols reunion. In the standoff with Virgin in the early months of 1981, Virgin apparently really pushed to have the song Public Image re-released as a single. That was how much they disliked The Flowers of Romance and how uncommercial they found it. Needless to say, this proposal was roundly rejected. And also picking up from the later 1980 interviews, Levine is still very big on name-dropping Brian Eno, and as opposed to the 1980 idea of music for wimpy bars, and boy, I really kind of wish this had happened. I mean, the music for wimpy bars would have been pretty cool. But even cooler, Keith asserts that they should make music for prisons. And god damn it, that is truly a missed opportunity. That Public Image Ltd making music for prisons as a post-Flowers of Romance statement is as much, I dare say, of a lost opportunity as John not starring in Quadrophenia. That is incredible. So, but the same thing from 1980, he's still into the layers of sound, and that you have to listen again and again and again to parse out everything that's happening within their music. And again, asserts that it is background music, that it somehow is related to ambient music. Keith is really into this. And as opposed to 1980, I feel like it gets even more pushback here. The other interesting thing from the Enemy interview is Lydon talks about his lyric writing process, which I think by this point, especially after the full flowering of his lyric style on Metal Box, I think you kind of see, starting with Pied Piper and really moving into this album, an ethos of you say the most in the lyrics with the least amount of words. Also that week, they talk to the melody maker. Another interesting thing to note, by the way, about these interviews is they aren't being held at, by and large, they aren't being held at Gunter Grove anymore. They seem to do most of their press at the Virgin offices this time around. The other thing to note, and make out of this what you will, we'll be touching upon this more later, Keith vanishes for long periods of time while they're being interviewed, and either Lydon or Jeanette have to sort of fill in and pick up the slack, so to speak. So anyway, Melody Maker interview is also interesting. Keith bangs away at that they want to primarily be a film and video company, just like Sony. He is really, really hyper-focused on this. They are back to slagging off the Clash. The Clash talk, it's laid off the Clash talk a little bit in 1980. The Clash talk is back in action. They have a lot of slagging to do, especially of Sandinista. Sandinista seemed to greatly displease both Lydon and Levine. And the other interesting thing to note about the Melody Maker interview, and I absolutely love this, Keith's brilliant one-off line in the Tom Snyder interview of "We only know what we don't like" now has been embedded and meshed into the corporation's world outlook with "we all know what we don't want." And that is something that also, again, gets repeated again and again. Keith has really seized upon that and is running with it. We know what we don't want. So on March 27th of 1981, Public Image Ltd. Finally released their first new single in ages, Flowers of Romance. This, of course, is the 12-inch version. I don't know where I got this. I don't know when or where I purchased this. I got it at some point along the way. So, at any rate, though, it is technically a sideways cover. This is actually the spine, but I hold it up thusly. This mirror was in the Anton Corbijn photos in the Keith Levine shoot from the previous year. And did this pop up also in, I forget which other single artwork that this strange spiderwebby mirror might have popped up in. But I feel like you can start to see already the iconography, the vibe, the visual aesthetic of this time. Very, very strange. But even stranger on the back is this, a sort of creepy, vampirish, almost new romantic, but dingier, darker, stranger, like a Sears photo from people residing on the other side of hell. What an odd, interesting, compelling photo, coupled with that font and then just the general starkness. So, this is the Flowers of Romance. It's a hell of a name. What's in a name? Well, that's going to lead us off onto a couple different threads of discussion here as we get into the song and talk about, and as we move into album talk eventually, soon, yes. So, the Flowers of Romance, I forget when I learned this. I learned this at some point in the 90s, I don't remember, but was something of a lost Sex Pistols song. And there are two versions of it on this box set. And when did this business come out? This came out in 2002. I purchased this, I want to say, in 2004, after there was a record store. I don't know if it's still there. There was an old hippie that owned the building. His parents had inherited it from his parents. So I don't know if the record store is still there. Last time I parked over in that way was back when I was single, and it was a very, very, very horrible date, and I wound up getting a ticket in the parking lot across the street from the record store, so I haven't been back there since. But they had all these very expensive import box sets up on the wall, sort of behind the counter. So after staring at this for like a year and a half, or whatever the hell it was, I finally plunked down for it, and it was very, very, very worth it. I absolutely love this. But this, on disc 3, has the famous Screen on the Green gig, but it also has some live rarities. There are two versions from 1976 of the Flowers of Romance. One is and the Pistols used to use it basically as a set opener, as a kind of a potential room clearing, what are you rebelling against, what do you got, kind of freeform, screw you sort of opening. These two versions of the song could not possibly be more different. In fact, all they share in common is a title. The first one is a very odd, distended set of component parts that's sort of a rock song. It sounds like it could be a song. They're very seriously lo-fi. It's cool. It's really, really interesting, but it is also disorganized cubist chaos as an arrangement, with Lydon spouting something largely incomprehensible over the top. The second version, which is from the Barbarella's in Birmingham. So the first one is at the 100 Club, and the second version is from 2 months later in August of 76. That is about 1.5 minutes, and that's more just sort of a noise, sort of rusty guitar feedback freak out. But and that's the set opener, and after 90 seconds of this of noise and some sort of general chaos, Lydon, in total piss take style, goes, "That was our first number." so that is the Flowers of Romance for that. Now, the Flowers of Romance, for those of you up on your punk rock history, is by this point a near legendary band that never recorded anything. So unlike the Screamers, who famously never made an album, the Flowers of Romance didn't even get that far. So the Flowers of Romance, it's one of those things, and Levine talked about this in one of his later interviews that if I can remember I will link to, because it's the most I think anybody's ever really said about the Flowers of Romance. It's a strange tale. They were a completely open-ended punk band, not really, and kind of in the same way that early Susie and the Banshees was arrhythmic, atonal, again, free-form, open-ended, freak out. That's the sense that I get of what the Flowers of Romance were. The drummer for the Flowers of Romance was, of course, Sid Vicious, but a lot of people cycled in and out of the Flowers of Romance, including members of the Slits, and it's very unclear if Keith Levine himself was ever actually a member. Now, where this sort of takes another step is that there's obviously the history with Sid in the Pistols, and Sid being the #1 fan of the Pistols before he was in the band. There's the fact that they had John had the Pistols, the early Pistols, had the freeform freak out Flowers of Romance song. John named the band the Flowers of Romance. And then there's the business of Keith being in the Clash. Mick Jones's girlfriend famously was Viv Albertine, who Keith taught her how to play the guitar. So Keith was super deep in with Viv Albertine. He gave Palmolive her name. He claims that he more or less taught the Slits how to play their respective instruments, as they're sort of cycling in and out of the Flowers of Romance. And then also Keith has said that he is the one who taught Sid both guitar and bass, and to his dying day basically claimed that Sid was a far, far better bass player than people ever gave him credit for. And I have to say, when Sid's actually playing, and Steve Jones has talked about this, like when they went to Sweden and stuff, when Sid was actually playing, he was all right. I mean, he wasn't a great virtuoso. Lydon said he could have been the bass player in Pill, but obviously there was a lot going on with Sid by that point. I don't know. What was Sid's level of musicianship? It is still very hard to say. But Keith always claimed he was much better than people thought he was, and that Sid could, play guitar to some extent. There aren't any recordings. We don't really know. And by extension, the Flowers of Romance is this sort of completely open-ended ghost band of sort of endless possibility. So what a strange title for John, a couple of years after the fact, after Wobbles left and after other members of Public Image Ltd. have left. What a strange title for John to pluck out of the ether to use. Now, That being said, that for the actual name of the album, apparently, Virgin Records actually picked the name of the album. Apparently, Lydon had suggested that I think there's only 9 songs on the album, but that apparently it be called something along the lines of like 10 short stories. So I don't know how much intentionality to read into actually titling the whole album, The Flowers of Romance. But what an odd title to use. Now, especially since, like some of the subject matter on Album and then Happy and then 9, and even kind of That What Is Not, this, I mean, I think there was always a thread of this, and you can go to Attack and you can look at Albatross on Metal Box, but I feel like this was the first really, like, solid John kiss-off to those of the past in a more, I don't know, in a more organized, written out sort of fashion, if that makes any sense, given how indistinct Attack is. I don't know. It is just a thought. But this single, which again I really don't remember when I got this, probably in the 2000s. I just don't know. But this is the vinyl, and it is like my Memories single. It's a wobbler. Oh, I confused Rolf Harris with Bob Harris in the last video. Whispering Bob Harris. Somebody pointed that out in the comments. I'm very glad they did. It is Whispering Bob Harris, not no. So no, I should not confuse them two, but those two. But at any rate, though it is also like the Memories single, vinyl wise, a wobbler. It sounds fucking amazing. I really do believe, not to be that guy, but though the Metal Box reissue is very good sounding and everything, I still think that the best medium to hear Public Image Ltd in is vinyl. So, sorry, truly not to be that guy, but it really is. I feel like there's a whole, I don't know, extrasensory sound element that somehow doesn't fully translate into the digital realm, perhaps. I don't know. But at any rate, the single mix is slightly different. The single was, if I understand, remixed by Lydon and Levine and Nick Launay in December after the album was actually finished. Nick Launay believes that the single mix is better. It's not wildly different. However, I do think that the single, I do agree with him. I do think that the single mix is better. While there are more elements in it, it is also more spacious, and it is a really, really incredible piece of work. I think we'll talk more about the song when I get into album talk. But if you ever find a copy of this, you should absolutely hear it if you haven't heard it like in this form, because it is very, very, very well worth it. And just as a sensory experience, it is pretty incredible. The 12-inch version, then, so it's sort of a 3-in-1, because it actually goes into its own instrumental remix upon the finishing of the title song. And the instrumental remix, which is on this, Songs from the Heart, which also has the single mix on it. I will also say, where did I first hear the single mix? Yes, on here, Plastic Box, of course. And I will be touching upon the interpretation of The Flowers of Romance, the album, on this in a few minutes when we do get to album talk. But the instrumental mix, I absolutely love. I think it could have been on the album, really. That's how much I like it. You could have bookended the album with it. I think it's fantastic. Especially for an album that has sort of something of a mock, odd, theatrical bent. I think it could have worked as sort of like playoff music, perhaps. But the instrumental is awesome. There's a much more shrieking violin on it. And it's kind of, this is an odd comparison that no one would ever make. It's a little, the enjoyability of listening to it is not unlike, here it comes, the Beach Boys Stacks of Tracks album, where you get to really enjoy everything that's happening without the vocal, because Lydon commands so much attention. I will just say here, though, Lydon's vocal performance is unbelievable, and in a weird way, even another step in development past what he was doing on the metal box. It is rather extraordinary. B-side, Home is Where the Heart Is. Yes, Home is Where the Heart Is finally gets released. Now, like a doof, I completely forgot to talk about the original recording of Home is Where the Heart Is on the metal box reissue. That was recorded March 11th, 1980, so that's Wobble playing on that. But they took Wobble's bass, they looped it, and basically remixed and reconfigured the track from there. Nick Launay did, my understanding is Nick Launay more or less did the mix, and then Keith Levine approved it, is I believe the sequence of events. I might be wrong, I don't think I am, but this is, Home is Where the Heart is absolutely a phenomenal song. It's a great final statement from Wobble. I will say this, I have taken the end of the 79 recordings, where Wobble and Levine were working somewhat independently, making backing tracks and stuff like Bad Baby and Home is Where the Heart Is and Pied Piper. And I have actually made an album out of that a couple times, and I forget what I had called it, but that does hang together as an album. You could take the end of 79, beginning of 80 recordings and just put that out, and just put that together, and have a really beautiful listening experience. But Home is Where the Heart Is on here, I think this is still, though, the definitive version. What the mixing and editing of Martin Atkins's drum track alone, and by the way, this is not the original issue because Jim Walker is not credited on the sleeve, so this is a reprint from somewhere along the way. But for whatever reason, there was a slip up and Jim Walker was credited. I don't really know what that was about, but a vast echoing, and Nick Launay talks about how Lydon had wanted triplet delay echo on things, and the original, we'll tell this story in a little bit, but that the original engineer didn't understand what they were talking about, but he did because he was into dub reggae. So this, in some ways, is probably some of the most overt dub-like mixing that Public Image Ltd. Ever did. But it is an extraordinary, extraordinary recording. Lydon's lyrics are almost the next chapter of No Birds Do Sing. And again, these clipped, compressed, I believe the word would be epigrams, but beautiful, beautiful imagistic lyrics, wailing away, and then Levine with, circular, kind of endlessly circular, ruminative guitar playing, and then that bass loop from Wobble, right? But also, again, the drum track. What an extraordinary drum track. This was often put on CD. Home is Where the Heart Is was often put on CD reissues of the Flowers of Romance album. It's not the version that I have. I'll be showing that later when we get to album talk. But it does make sense. You can see why it would be put there. It's not just from that was remixed in these sessions. Like it does fit in. But it is also then this sort of weird no man's land song, because I think lyrically it is 1 foot towards what could have worked for Wolfen, and 1 foot an extension of what was happening on the metal box. But when in the Public Image's Rotten documentary, when Martin Atkins talks about the gravity of Pill and how that was lost in the middle 80s, that started getting lost, I think this is a perfect example. The imposing gravity and undeniability, the tension, the atmosphere, the hyper intense creativity is just absolutely remarkable. So this is a pretty incredible single, and if you ever see a copy, I really would recommend it, because the artwork is beautiful as a complete package, as a complete record. This is absolutely extraordinary. So moving on. So, April 3rd, 1981, Lydon Levine do an interview with Hot Press, and a couple really beautiful things that I pulled out of that. was the journalist asks about the starkness of the packaging and how this is not a video album. It does not go beyond, again, kind of getting called out for lack of productivity. Where's all the things that you've been talking about? Where are the things that have been promised? And why did you do something like just put out another album, right? Because they had raised expectations so high. Lydon has a great line about that. After Metal Box, we just wanted the simplest sleeve possible because there's no point in continuing with that. We'd have to give away free speedboats or something to top that, which is wonderful. Regarding the sort of character assassination aspect of the Flowers of Romance, which it is not a character assassination, it's too simple. Also just because the lyrics go into so many other areas and suggest / imply an ahistorical time jump nature that is too interesting and has too many layers of it to simply have it be that it is a finger-pointing song or a put-down song. But Lydon certainly has gone to that well and goes to that well quite a lot after that. And the interviewer presses him about the negativity of his lyrics in going at people. And Lydon says, "Oh, I'd say they're optimistic. The fact that I can waste my time pointing out other people's bad sides obviously shows there's room for improvement. I wouldn't waste my energy on a lost cause, would I?" So, again, another sort of variation on positive negativism. And then finally, for all of the talk about that Keith goes on about getting a grant from Sony, or trying to be like Sony, or getting a grant from ICI, or any of these other things. Keith, and God bless him, they start actually sort of trying to ask him like sort of business-related questions, to which Keith responds, "I don't know anything about the stock market. I know diamonds are worth money." One day later, on April the 4th, and I had somehow heard about this. This kind of achieved minor league urban legend status at some point. I heard about this before I think I ever heard the album. But on April 4th of that year, the NME published an April Fool's listing that Ginger Baker had joined Public Image Ltd. Because how ridiculous would that be? That could never, ever, ever happen. And then jump forward to my 1985-86 pill video. Haha. So, anyway. Then, a few days later, on April the 9th, the three-person lineup, John, Jeanette, and Keith Levine, appeared on Top of the Pops, where, let's wheel it out again, yaha, here, right here, on both of these. So that's where I first saw these. This has also since come out in cleaned up form on the Songs from the Heart box set. They're miming to the track, so it's not like it's a live performance. I don't know how the hell a three-person lineup could have recreated it, but Keith dressed up like, I don't know, sort of a mad scientist, perhaps, on these drums, sort of these big percussion pieces of percussion. I'm not sure what sort of drums they are. Lydon in a priest's collar, and I forget the thing that goes with it, but the collar, playing a violin periodically, and then Jeanette Lee appears to be wearing the same clothes from the back of the Flowers of Romance single. The same sort of odd, new romantic, highly done-up Mozart in exile outfit that she's wearing, is sitting playing a cello. It's a really cool performance. Lydon is super commanding. They use the opportunity, the producers of the show, to go crazy with the early 80s digital special effects, and it's really, really cool. It's only not as earth-shaking as the other television performances from Public Image Ltd. Because they simply have set the standard so incredibly high for themselves. The next day, on April 10th, The Flowers of Romance, the album, finally, actually comes out. And we will be getting into album talk in just a moment. I'm going to finish running through the rest of their press appearances from this year first. On April the 16th, they do an interview with Smash Hits. This is the one where Keith really keeps vanishing. and Jeanette has to do the most talking that she does. She also talks about how she seemed eager to stress that she didn't play anything on the album, though she did play a role in the mixing. The other thing that is interesting is, and you'll notice this if I can find it, Rich, prompt time, if I can find it, the ad for the Flowers of Romance album is, people talk about New Romantic, you know, there's sort of that because of what else was happening in England and in America at that time. But really, the ad for the album I like as much as I like the album or the single artwork. And it is that sort of Canterbury Tales or illuminated manuscript style that, funnily enough, you see on some of my favorite album artwork ever, King Crimson's Lizard. And what's interesting is, in the Smash Hits interview, they are pressing, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, they're pressing Pill for being in league with the likes of Bow Wow Wow and Adam and the Ants, and talking about, and also that they are channeling Moroccan sounds. In other interviews, Keith has said that they were listening to Renaissance music at the time, that was the music that I guess was playing a lot around Gunter Grove. And Jeanette, I believe it's Jeanette, says it's not Moroccan, it's Renaissance, early English and French 15th century. That's what I've been listening to a lot. That's real traditional English music. I think actually John might have said this quote. Never mind. I apologize. I think this is John's quote. Real traditional English music. Nowadays, when anyone wants to make a record, they seem to look to any far-off distant place they can imitate. They never realize it's here on their own doorstep. So it is interesting that John did say that. I don't know why I said Jeanette a moment ago. It's interesting that John says that, but in a different interview, Keith said, "Oh, the only thing we've been listening to is Renaissance music." I found that absolutely fascinating. Also, in April of 1991, the three-person Pill lineup does an interview for Zigzag again with the great Chris Needs, who I talked about in the '79 video, I believe. And, is a favorite of the Under Review series. I love Chris Needs. He's a really, really good writer. He's really smart. I basically just like everything about Chris Needs. I feel like he really gets it right. Interestingly, this interview, or part of this interview, came out on a picture disc, apparently in the second half of the 80s at some point, I guess in England. 15 minutes of the audio of this interview is up on YouTube, if I can remember. I'm going to link it, because it's just really interesting, especially just to hear Keith kind of talk at length. But the one thing I did want to note, again, is Keith talks about Eno and Bowie, and they're basically the only music that he really, contemporary music that he seems to like. So later on in life, Keith fully embraced his love of the Beatles and his love of Bowie. And he really, really kind of quintupled down on his love of Bowie, in fact. But it is just interesting to see that here, and to see that at this time. Lydon mentions Eno in a negative way a couple times. And John didn't have anything good to say about Bowie for years, basically. And then when Bowie died, I forget which song it was. It was at Signet Committee? I forget which song. He posted on their website. And then in the book tour Q&A that I saw on YouTube a few years ago, whenever that was, he rhapsodized about Bowie. So I don't really know what that was all about. He seemed to... he at one point literally looks up at the ceiling and screams, "I love you, Dave." So you make out of that what you will. One thing I did want to talk about as we sort of get into album talk is to talk about the album a little bit, maybe something of a tangential way first, which is to say what the state of Public Image Ltd. Was at this time. And I think it would be kind of interesting to think of it in terms of what their relationship to their peers was like. So Pill, had always been pretty way out in front of everything. And I think you couldn't come up with additions to this all the time, or you could have, obviously, watching this would have your own opinions on these matters. But I am sort of the opinion, as I have been making these videos and as I've talked about it before, I'm kind of the opinion that the only people sort of near them, the only bands kind of near them would be Joy Division, the Raincoats, the Slits to a degree, and the pop group. I think that's kind of it. I guess you could also say Throbbing Gristle, right? But Throbbing Gristle are so much off in their own universe. But that's sort of as far as their contemporaries in England. I think beyond that, up to this point, they were kind of far beyond anybody else, right? What's interesting is by the end of 1980, of course, Ian Curtis is gone. And I think the blackening cloud in England, as the National Front sort of keeps getting worse, Thatcher keeps consolidating more and more power around herself. You then have the incoming presidency of Reagan. All of these different factors and the sort of the Reagan-Thatcher alliance. So it's interesting at this point. I think that, and I'm going to talk more about this next year when I do Pill in 82 and 83, but I think there is something of a, in 1980, if you want to consider John as, there was always the Pistols, the Clash, and the Damned, right? So if you want to count Keith as part of the Clash and John by extension the Pistols, I think 1980 is something of a sort of a peak year for everybody, because the Clash carry London Calling into 1980, the Damned on the back of the incredible Machine Gun Etiquette album make this, the Black Album, where they really go off into musical exploration even further than what they had already started doing on Machine Gun Etiquette. This is an absolutely incredible album. And then you have and it's right down here. And then you have the Clash with Sandinista, another expansive album. And so this sort of Black Album, Sandinista, Metal Box, these are bigger, more expansive, more, I dare say, confident statements coming off of the initial burst of what they had done. And even though John and Keith had very little time for Sandinista, of course, right? My thoughts on Sandinista, we'll get to that maybe some other time. I have many contradictory thoughts about this album, but I certainly respect the sprawl of it, right? But I think post-Sandinista, I think it's safe to say that the Clash start drifting a bit. I wouldn't say that the Damned were drifting, but when we get to the videos next year, I think the Clash, the Damned, and then Pill, by extension for the Sex Pistols, all start dissolving right around the same time and in somewhat similar ways. And their reactions to that all kind of weirdly mirror each other. It is very strange. But I think the thing is, the other thing to note is that right around the time that Flowers of Romance came out, the initial run of the Buzzcocks was over. They had put out a different kind of tension in '79, but these the Parts singles. I have the third one. I don't have the first two, but the Parts singles produced by Martin Hannett. And I love these. I think this stuff is amazing. But that is kind of, it sort of presents, as much as I love it and as much as you could see how they could have gone forward, it sort of presents the Buzzcocks at something of a cul-de-sac, especially with Pete Shelley's like endlessly repetitious songs, and him also now taking more of an increasingly co-role in the songwriting of the band, and I guess in the overall direction of the band. So that's also an interesting aspect of it. So the Buzzcocks were sort of at this, kind of in this weird malaise period. But also, one of the funny things, and I'll detail this a little bit more when we get into album talk, but Pill, in this time, and as they were kind of being attacked by the press, not attacked, but their feet being held to the fire a little bit in a way that they wouldn't have been previously, Pill sort of, to me, feels like they fell to number one. Because all of a sudden, you look around and a lot of their contemporaries are right there next to them in terms of really fascinating subject matter, conceptual depth, artistic depth, musical exploration. And I still think Pill is still kind of the leaders at this point, but it's much, much closer. And one of the things that's interesting, and we'll touch upon this in a few minutes, but The Flowers of Romance is weirdly of a piece with this, the second Gang of Four album, Solid Gold. This is an absolutely phenomenal album, and another bleak, I mean, as bleak as Flowers of Romance is, this is also very, very bleak and desolate, and another very extremely impressive statement. And I absolutely love this album. I recently saw a vinyl copy of it that I really wanted to buy because I just love it so much, but it was like $50 or something, and I just couldn't justify myself to swing it. But this is an absolutely incredible album, and I don't know that you could necessarily play it next to The Flowers of Romance because the Gang of Four is still very much playing as a band, and we'll get to that with Flowers of Romance, but it's still really, really impressive. But again, other music that I think is of a piece is Susie and the Banshees' Juju. This is right there. And in fact, you know, the Spellbound single, the Spellbound video could have been something that Public Image Ltd. did. It could have been something for Wolfen, for that matter. So this is also a really, really fascinating, dark, bleak album. And there is this, with all of this stuff, there is a sort of, again, desolate, vampirish quality to some of this. Nick Launay, and again, we'll get into this in a second, speaking of bleak and desolate, worked on the next Killing Joke album. What's this for? This could very well be my favorite Killing Joke album. And if you like The Flowers of Romance, my God, this is a just hop, skip, and a jump. And the Pill talks about bands that used Nick Launay and used their approach. I mean, this would probably be the first record, though I would have to imagine they would have already had a lot of this written. But my God, this is right in line with what you hear on The Flowers of Romance. And then the one where they actually overtly talked about it would be the second and I guess final of their original run, Slits album, which was done just after and uses Nick Launay and future Pill drummer, also pop group drummer Bruce Smith, who we've talked about before. Return of the Giant Slits, and this is again kind of their masterpiece. I think even more so than their first album. And this, again, they're all sort of in this odd, not quite third world outside of the world, bleak, desolate. This is less vampirish, but it still feels very inward. It's inward and otherworldly at the same time. And again, their music video for Earthbeat could have been something that Pill had created. It could have been something that Jeanette Lee came up with in terms of iconography and stylizing. It all of this weirdly feels of a piece. And I guess finally, before we get into the album proper, the only other thing I'll say in regards to Pill sort of falling to number one, if you will, is just this sense that instead of the feeling, the kinetic excitement of the first album and then the grand sprawling masterpiece that is the metal box, what has always, the tone of The Flowers of Romance as an album that has always struck me is similar to that of, well, two things that you may not normally associate with Public Image Ltd. For one, you damn sure wouldn't, the Rolling Stones. It's one of the reasons I love Between the Buttons so much. Between the Buttons has that feel of a bunch of people just cloistered together and making something very quickly and willing to throw ideas out there. Actually, I thought of another one. My favorite White Stripes album, their least characteristic, but Get Behind Me, Satan, has that quality of just Jack and Meg just woodshedding ideas quickly. And then the final one, and in a weird way, in terms of iconography, also kind of weirdly mirrors as the sort of the inverse or opposite of the darkness of The Flowers of Romance. Here's one you never would associate: Prince's Lovesexy. Prince's Love. I mean, from what I understand, he holed himself up for 4 to 6 weeks just by himself in Paisley Park. I think it was the first album he did en toto in Paisley Park. And it has that same weird, introverted, woodshedding quality. And it doesn't have the grand confidence or the sense that it is as much of a grand statement. Certainly not like with the Stones, certainly not compared to Aftermath, or certainly not compared to even Satanic Majesties, and certainly by the time you get to Beggar's Banquet or Let It Bleed. So that's kind of the tone of the record. It has a very strange, what happened to these guys tone that, again, insular and weirdly not confident given the sort of recent triumphs. So I've always thought about that, and this is one of the only Pill albums that you can legitimately hear, I think, in relation to other music. And again, we'll touch upon Nick Launay in a second, because then there are the albums that, which I've already have touched on to a degree, but there are the albums that really bear the influence on this. So in that sort of falling to number one, they are not just in league with their peers, but they're also more immediately influential to the rest of the music industry at large. It's odd. It's a strange one. And finally, the other thing I will say about this album, before we really get into the proper album talk, I have talked about before about how I had gotten all my Public Image Ltd. albums. Most of them I bought in one go on vinyl one day. I got this a little later, and I got this because, again, I would have gotten it anyway, but the single, The Flowers of Romance, was here on Greatest Hits So Far, which I always really, really liked. Now, initially, I really liked the song, but I am going to trot out, yes, it's all coming out today, 1992 Rolling Stone Album Guide. And this is what the 1992 Rolling Stone Album Guide, look at how poorly they thought of Public Image Ltd. Can you see that? Terrible. But this is so they praise second edition to the skies, right? And then on The Flowers of Romance, Lydon seems to have already run out of ideas. And this was the key sentence there. Pseudo-ethnic percussion and free-ranging spleen don't add up to much of a statement, let alone an antidote to boredom. And basically from here, what they determine is that Lydon was good for one single for each album, something of a meta-pop statement, and gets off a few cheap, easy lines. But the albums, you don't want to deal with the albums after that point, because all he was good for was a single. And that really starts with The Flowers of Romance. I don't think that couldn't be more wrong-minded to me. And my goodness, how full of shit do you have to be to think that? Absolutely ridiculous. Now, I knew the song, the title song from the Greatest Hits So Far, but I remember a couple people that not liking this album. Like, you would talk to people about Public Image Ltd. and they would sort of talk down about this album. So, really, I I had the album. I had it on vinyl, and here it is, right? And we'll get into this in a few minutes. But what really shifted my relationship to it, and I thought it was cool, and I was like, why do people not like this? I thought maybe it was a little patchy, or I didn't quite grasp it or something. So yet again, here's my busted up copy, my original busted up copy of Metal Box, or Plastic Box. But here, this is the reissue version. And what is interesting is they reconfigured the track listing on disc 2 of this. So the track listing the side-by-side, the track listing on disc 2 of Plastic Box is Flowers of Romance, Four Enclosed Walls, Phenogen, Track 8, Jaime's Hymn, Under the House, Banging the Door, Go Back, and Francis Massacre. Interesting. And then it ends with Home is Where the Heart Is. And this sequence was the sequence that actually really opened up the album to me. And the album started weirdly making more sense to me with this as a sequence. I eventually went back to the real album. So I would have had this first, I believe, on CD. And it was kind of like, well, wait, how did I not connect with this album? How did I not understand this album? This album is absolutely tremendous. And indeed it is. This is the CD version that has the lyrics on the inside. And so it's funny how these things change over time. I probably had the album for, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it was, before I really started to fully understand its depth and greatness. And it's one of those things whereas I understood Metal Box or second edition immediately and was immediately in love with it, this album grew over time. But as it grew, I only loved it more and more and more and more. So the record that I have for this, so this is the lyric sheet, the all black sleeve. This is the Warner Brothers version that I have. So this is what I got, people. And this plays perfectly fine. Like, I love it. At some point I think it would be cool to like hunt down a version, but there's so many records in the world. But what I do love is this back cover. I absolutely love this. I think that this is that black, that shade of red, that is perfect. It also gives a very, very good visual indication of what the album sounds like. And then we have this extremely random photo of Jeanette Lee on the cover, and this is also, again, a top-loading album cover because, as you can see, it opens on the side. So, however, the CD issue, everything always has Jeanette right side up. So that's just how I keep it, Jeanette right side up. But I mean, what a beautiful, strange, mysterious, odd non sequitur of a photo. I absolutely adore this. I think it's fantastic. So anyway, the Flowers of Romance, the album, started off life at the Manor, and where Keith noted that they had 36 they set up shop. They had 36 channels for mixing, and he used 18 for drums and percussion. And the other thing I will add about this is, so my sources for this video are engineer Nick Launay's incredible interview with Fodderstumpf.com. Also a couple things that because they interviewed him in the Public Image's Rotten documentary. Martin Atkins, a couple different Martin Atkins interviews. But Keith Levine in the early 2000s did 2 sprawling interviews, one with Fodderstumpf, which was awesome, but the big one is the 4-parter on Perfect Sound Forever, which is probably the great sort of testament of his life and about his life's work. It's just fantastic. The other then is an interview with Ed Caraballo which we'll get to in the Ritz Riot. That was also on Perfect Sound Forever. So those are my main sources. Now, Keith, it could be argued, perhaps, I don't know, I want to tread lightly here, maybe gilds the lily little bit about his involvement in the making of this album. I say that because in the years subsequent to his sprawling Perfect Sound Forever interview, Martin Atkins and John Lydon talked about Keith not being around that much. And whereas Keith, I say this with love and respect, Keith has a tendency to make it sound as if he was orchestrating every single move that was happening on the album, more or less. That's not really the case, it turns out. Keith obviously is hugely, hugely crucial. But according to Martin Atkins, and also Nick Launay mentions this kind of in an aside in his interview, Keith, for his part, played a lot of Space Invaders during this time. And if you know anything about heroin addicts, you know that for whatever reason they tend to like soft foods. They tend to like mashed potatoes, for instance. In Keith's case, it was custard. So Martin Atkins' sort of visual memory of the making of this album were endless empty bowls of custard, because that's what Keith would eat whilst either working intensely on the album or spending endless hours playing Space Invaders. So, but they set up shop at the Manor. And there are, interestingly for Public Image Ltd, who don't usually have a ton of outtakes. There's like alternate mixes and stuff, but normally, generally speaking, what's cut is used in some form, right? However, for whatever reason, the Flowers of Romance amassed some really, really interesting unused material. And two things from the Manor, though, have never come out, because I don't think that they could just for copyright reasons. But the recordings at the Manor didn't go very well, and in terms of productivity, in terms of quality, absolutely. But we'll get to that. But what they had to show for it were basically karaoke versions, where they would use the backing track but not the vocal of John shrieking hideously, apparently, or shrieking furiously, versions of the Beatles' Twist and Shout and Johnny Remember Me. So those have never been heard. Those will never be heard. They were on tape because they were played for Martin Atkins when they reassembled at the Townhouse as a listen to this, But they will most likely never be heard. The one story that I did want to mention that I think is interesting is that at the Manor is where they did the final mix of Home Is Where the Heart Is. And I forget the name of the original engineer, but that's where Nick Launay comes into the mix. Nick Launay tells this story in the FodderStomp.com interview. I strongly recommend you read it if you have never read it, because he gets into a couple specific technical details of things, of how the records were actually really made, and some of that stuff is over my head. He is a great fucking person. And Nick Launay, very, very young, very green, yet had the right idea basically about everything. And we'll get into his post-pill resume sort of at the end of album talk. But Nick Launay, God bless him, just like that's what you would want in somebody in the studio, is somebody who's going to foster creativity and encourage it, right? But Nick Launay, Nick Launay tells the story that they went in there, I guess, to work on, I think the Wolfen soundtrack was maybe still a vague possibility at this point. But the original title of Home Is Where the Heart Is was Doom Sits in Gloom, which is really, really interesting. That was the actual working title of it, according to Nick Launay. But they had this engineer. John wanted the triplet echo delay. The guy didn't understand, and John actually locked the guy out and basically promoted Nick to to be their engineer. But other than recording Jaime's hymn, which we will get to in due time, that was all they wound up with at the Manor, was the final mix of Home Is Where the Heart Is, which is incredible. Jaime's him, and then these two kind of insane karaoke recordings. And that was all they had to show for it. So when they went to work at the townhouse, or at Townhouse, I don't know if there's a "the" there, according to Nick Launay, he really emphasized that they had absolutely no songs written at all, and that nearly everything was improv'd on the spot by the band members. So we will finally just get into this. So, The Flowers of Romance, one of the greatest albums ever made, one of the true masterpieces of all time, I'll just say, begins very, very dramatically with the incredible Four Enclosed Walls. Now, Martin Atkins has told the story many times that... Oh, and I didn't really get into... They decided that they needed a drummer, so they brought Martin in to record on a few songs, basically. So, anyway, Martin Atkins tells the story, and he's told the story. I feel like I've heard versions of this story in any number of interviews that he's given, that when Pill was on the U.S. tour, he went to Disneyland. He bought a Mickey Mouse watch. He had the watch under his pillow or something as he was trying to sleep. When he was back in England, he was on amphetamine trying to sleep. Sounds to be at opposite, cross purposes there, but was hearing all of these rhythms from the mechanics of the watch. Brought the watch into the studio. Nick Launay put it on a tom-tom so it would reverberate, and then hooked it up to, I guess, a harmonizer. I don't really understand that technical equipment. Especially from back then, I don't get it. But at any rate, that's what creates the really weird opening sound effects. That sort of jump scare before in the opening. The jump scare is achieved via backwards piano. One of the instructions, because they didn't have any songs, that Keith Levine gave to Nick Launay was to make sure to record everything. So there were sort of two dictums. The one, record everything, because we don't know what we'll use for the record. We don't know what will get turned into a song. The other was to constantly run things backwards, and that, I think, may have been a little bit more of Nick's idea, but certainly Pill were game for it, and certainly Keith was into that. So, at any rate, the drum beat, the ultimate drum beat, all that Led Zeppelin, John Bonham talk on in the album video was again not for nothing. You have the drum beat, the ultimate drum beat. Is this the ultimate drum sound? Perhaps. I'll touch upon that. I'll touch upon this aspect of things right now, I suppose. I feel that The Flowers of Romance, among many other things, is basically the first album of the 90s. This, and as I have said before, Red Cross's Teen Babes from Monsanto, somewhere a crossbreed of those two things somehow create the sound of the 90s and a lot of the attitude of the 90s. Part of the reason I say that is because Martin Atkins's drums wind up somehow becoming the drum sound of Wax Trax and all subsequent music informed by Wax Trax, and it also becomes basically the prototype of what Steve Albini does. So this is the drum sound. This is it. And it is absolutely, utterly incredible. I will be circling back to this idea that this is kind of the first album of the 90s throughout this video, if I can bloody remember to do that, to make that point again and again. But the other thing I want to say is, I had talked about how Martin Atkins, I think, really is the definitive drummer of Public Image Ltd. Why is he the definitive drummer? Because this is one of the most definitive drum beats in the second half of the 20th century. I mean, this is as good as a drum beat, and as a drum beat being the center of the recording is ever going to get. Public Image Ltd, like the Stooges when they made Raw Power, had the intuitive intelligence to make the flaw in the canvas, in this case, because there wasn't a band, in the case of the Stooges, because it was recorded all fucked up, but to make the flaw in the canvas, the canvas. And so they just fill all of this incredible empty space, and they utilize all of this incredible empty space. Pill was already stark. They figured out a way to get starker. They figured out a way to, if you will, paint over the photograph, to highlight and emphasize things. It is... Martin Atkins is the definitive drummer of Public Image Ltd, simply put, because no other drummer would have carved out that sonic identity for themselves, and he did, and he brought in the Mickey Mouse watch. It's absolutely incredible, and he was encouraged by Nick Launay to really go for it, and then didn't shut it down when Nick Launay did his stuff with the harmonizer. It's incredible. Martin Atkins, this is Martin Atkins's claim to immortality as far as I'm concerned. No matter anything else that he ever did, and he did a whole hell of a lot after this, like Wobble, he just went on and on and on and on and on and on and on. But my God, this is it right here. This is his crystallized moment. That ultimate recontextualized, re-emphasized, studio-ified Bonham from the top of Mount Olympus fucking drum beat is unbelievable. And that the treatment of the drums is, I mean, that in a weird way kind of is the song in effect. But it isn't, because there's so much more. First of all of the coursing, pulsing, backing effects are, this sets the tone immediately. It sets the horror film that this, like the Marble Index, this is another horror movie, like, incarnate in the form of an album. And then you have, in which one of the Exorcists was it? I forget which one, where they start off in the Middle East. I forget now. Is it the second one or the third one? I don't remember. Anyway, or was it? Oh Jesus! Or was it The Omen? Oh my God! Now I don't remember. Anyway, I think it was the second or third Exorcist. But that is where we find John Lydon, and we find John Lydon. It was one thing for, at this time there was a lot of sort of gothic horror in music, whether, what Ozzy Osbourne was doing at this point, right? There was a lot of that there. You could say there was tongue-in-cheek to it, but even, Number of the Beast, for that matter, there was that in heavy metal, but for Lydon to take it and to take the, world events of the time and the Ayatollah and all of that. And this is this the best set of lyrics that he ever wrote? I don't know. It very well could be. He has taken what he has done in terms of, throughout Metal Box, and he has now expanded that past England, past the contrasting histories of England, and he has now sort of punctured that wall and is now out into the world with it. And it is a far-reaching, strange, impressionistic writing style that is absolutely monumental. I believe Nick Launay said that this was one of the songs that Lydon just wrote in one go. And that's another reason I tend to refer to this as one of the first albums of the 90s. Because in terms of creating interesting backing tracks and then the lead voice, and we'll get into this also in a second, more or less improving lyrics is what rappers would start doing in 10 years. I mean, that's the creative process of Gang Starr. That's the creative process of Wu-Tang. On and on and on. So, this is an absolutely I mean, this is a masterpiece. And then you have Lydon's vocal performance, the wailing subversion of the Islamic call to prayer. If you want to consider it a subversion, I would suppose that it is. I don't even know. This is so open to interpretation. And again, weirdly far-reaching. And Lydon's ability to jump in and out of time periods. It's incredible. But the full range of his voice, from the cackling to just the wailing intensity, this is 3 years out. Think about his vocal on 17 on Nevermind the Bollocks, right? Which I love, but like, think about that. Like, this is 3 years away from the guy that recorded EMI. That's unbelievable. That is a massive artistic leap. And the records along the way, that is a hell of a journey to have come in 3 goddamn years. So, it opens with an absolute, unbelievable, otherworldly, freaky, scary, unnerving, idiosyncratic, unbelievably creative masterpiece of an opener. A masterpiece on a masterpiece, if you will. Okay, you get the idea. Then we go into the second song, track 8. Now, track 8 was, I don't know why I thought this, but when I was younger, you know, in the late 90s, I thought that Pied Piper was an outtake from The Flowers of Romance. And I knew that Steve New had been around. And when I first heard the guitars on this, I somehow convinced myself, and Keith, you know, the few interviews I'd seen with Keith at that point were always emphasizing that he didn't play guitar on this album. So I somehow connected the dots in my, 22-year-old brain that that Steve New is playing on this. No, he isn't. Like, that has nothing to do with anything. So anyway, so track 8 was basically just a piece of music that they had started working on that, like what John and Yoko did on Yoko's Plastic Ono Band album, where they just would take little snippets of things out of that 90-minute jam session that basically birthed that album, right? This is another sort of version of that. This was apparently just a little snippet of a larger piece of recording that they had done that I guess wasn't really going anywhere, that they turned into a tape loop. Now, I am not sure. I think Keith might have been the one to seize upon it and build it up from there. It's apparently about a music journalist, a female music journalist, and I'm not gonna throw who it might be yet. But if you've been watching these videos, you can maybe put that one together. But anyway, but where I made the hip hop reference a moment ago, John is basically, I mean, this is sort of like proto rapping, and it's up near the top of his register. It is extremely prickly, even by his standards. But again, these incredible impressionistic lyrics, it's sort of the halfway point between Bodies and Tie Me to the Length of That. John has a remarkable ability to wring all sorts of pathos, drama, horror, and fear out of birthing and out of periods. It is remarkable, his ability to do that, and his ability to go back to that well, for lack of a better way of putting it. Remarkable set of lyrics and a remarkable vocal delivery, a world away from what he was just doing on Four Enclosed Walls. And then you have, my God, and then you have Keith's weird chock-a-block Andy Gill backwards, shot out of a rocket, fucking distended guitar parts that loop around each other. And what a bizarre off-kilter rhythm track. I mean, this could have been something on you know, on one of the last two Beefheart records. What an odd, unusual, amazing piece of music. And again, super creative, and how the hell did they come up with that? So, and again, we're still in this sort of realm, even though we're a world away, or half a world away from Four Enclosed Walls. We're still in this strange place of, I guess, horror, you would say. The next track, speaking of horror, is Phoenogen. I think it's called Phoenogen. I've never actually heard it said out loud. So Phoenogen picks up in terms of the spiraling soundscape of what they had started doing on Pied Piper, and goes and takes that into another realm. This also has a lot more backwards guitar on it, so Keith plays the backwards guitar, but what I always wondered were if it was some sort of piano or treated piano. I actually found out, I had never been able to figure out what it is, because that is a truly otherworldly sound that is at the beginning, and then they weave back in at the end. That is apparently the untuned strings of a banjo that John is hitting with a drumstick. And Phoenogen is another, like, I don't know who's playing drums. I would kind of assume that might just be Keith on the, or not drums, but the percussion. I might just assume that is him. I believe it is, and actually I'm just going to check the writing credits really quick. So I'm fairly certain that would be Keith on percussion. It could also be Lydon, but I do think it is Keith. But again, another strange use of empty space. And this is then almost like the answer song to Four Enclosed Walls. And, you know, again, what is it about? What are these odd, open-ended lyrics about? And the way John sings it, this truly sounds Middle Ages. John sounds, this might as well be Bring Out Your Dead. And it doesn't do John justice, I think, to say that it is theatrical or that it's acting. But I had made the analogy to Orson Welles' Macbeth in my Iggy Zombie Birdhouse video. This is sort of that level, and that level of I don't know, dark gothic, for lack of a better word, intensity. It is another incredible virtuoso vocal performance that, while I think shares connective tissue to Four Enclosed Walls, this is also wholly its own other thing. And so we now have three sets of vocals from Lydon that are all kind of worlds away from each other. But you can picture John in, you know, sort of Canterbury Tales sort of clothing, the dingy white with the ties, you know, the twine ties down the middle, you know, like lurching along in a muddy road as somebody pushes a wheelbarrow in the dirt as he's singing this in a declamatory fashion, and then the curtain falls at the end of Act 2 or something. Like you can picture it. It has this such a strange otherworldly intensity to it. And I mean, it could be something from the French Revolution as he's staring up at Versailles or something. Like it again, Lydon has only expanded his scope and range and depth and, I suppose, breadth. Incredible. Phoenogen is another, like, masterpiece on a masterpiece. This is just, you know, the idea that this is a relatively concise album and that it's that brilliant. Incredible. So the the next song is the title track. It's a more sort of streamlined mix. I do kind of prefer this. So it's Flowers of Romance. I do tend to prefer the single mix, but this is still pretty amazing. That is John on sax, and also John bowing a bass guitar. So that is how they achieved that effect, basically, and then using a lot of delays. I mean, this is one of the greatest like tracks or pieces of music that they ever came up with. That drum beat, that drum pattern, John talks, that's apparently also his. He is the one playing the percussion on this, and he talks about, again, the generosity of spirit of Nick Launay in allowing him to do things that were so unusually structured and so open-ended, and build this up, just at his own speed and at his own sense of musical logic. The other thing John says in the Public Image's Rotten documentary is he's talking about his words, about how his words aren't about wanting to be like anybody else, so why should his music? And I think that is a key point, because in the Sex Pistols, that's a synthesis of Glenn Matlock and then Steve Jones, and a fairly different sensibility. This is John Lydon's music, and tangential, but people, I know that he works with other people like Mel Mann and stuff, but people talked about Dr. Dre when he first left Death Row, saying that, he didn't produce most of the stuff that you hear, blah, 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 blah. But Death Row Records sounded different after Dre left, and there were certain things that carried on into Aftermath, and you can see the through line from NWA to Death Row to Aftermath. Like, that's Dre, and that's the common denominator. You get that with Prince sometimes, where people say, I came up with the whatever, and it's like, no. Like, you see the through line, and no, that's Prince. That's not anybody else. And I think that you can kind of see that with the Flowers of Romance when you get to John's solo album, Psychopath. Like, that's John. That's his sensibilities. And I think that what we kind of see happen later on in the Polka Dots and Dreadlocks era of Pill, I feel like this is kind of like the first sort of indication of that. And again, I talked about this in the album review, and when I cover those later albums at some point, I will talk about this. I really, really wish there had been more of that, because I feel like that was something that kind of got lost along the way. The other thing I meant to mention was the idea of potentially having called the album 10 Short Stories. Part of the idea, and I'm just sort of planting this for later, part of the idea was that 10 Short Stories would have been potentially a jumping off point for then making short films using these songs, or incorporating them in some way, or making films about the songs. So I meant to mention that before. The other thing I should probably mention is Nick Launay was basically considered a member of Public Image Ltd. While he was working on this album with them. And from what I understand, Keith offered him ongoing membership, which unfortunately Nick Launay didn't take, because he got all these production jobs immediately once this album got released. And we'll touch upon that a little bit more later. But right now we have to concern ourselves with the side closer. So we've had pretty amazing, unbelievable music up to this point. And now we get into, when I talk about how this invented the 90s, we get to side closer, Under the House. This is Wax Trax. This is Nine Inch Nails. But it is also the Melvins on the Atlantic trilogy, especially, I think, the Stoner Witch album. This is, in part, Pussy Galore / John Spencer Blues Explosion. It's, there are so many albums that you can point to where I feel like this is the starting guide. Kurt Cobain did not have The Flowers of Romance listed in his 50 favorite albums. It's like, it's not for nothing. This is, I think, in some way, a starting line of how hip-hop is made. We know that the Beastie Boys were influenced. This is Paul's Boutique. This shares a continued thread of DNA into Paul's Boutique. It shares a continued thread of DNA into Fear of a Black Planet. But what it also shares is, if one of the big formal innovations of the Beatles when they did Sgt. Pepper, or the Beatles of 1967, is that they were the first people to basically focus almost exclusively on creating backing tracks and using the studio as an instrument, and debanding the band, right? And using the studio to just create these various phantasmagorias and explorations of sound. The next people, I think, to really, really pick up on that were Eno and Bowie. I think, and they took it to another place. So, if you want to say what the Beatles were doing with psychedelia, you can say that the Berlin Trilogy is the next development of psychedelia. I think that this is the next development after that. This is the next wave. And what you get with the progeny of this album, whether it's the immediate, like the Slits or Killing Joke, but also a little further, another 10 years down the line. I think this shares DNA with Einstürzende Neubauten. I think this album connects to a lot of things. I think it connects also sideways, perhaps, to Throbbing Gristle and then what Psychic TV we're going to do. This is in that space, and there's an ethos there that is really, really evergreen and beautiful and hyper creative. And I think there are some metal bands that picked up on that and took it. So whether you want to get into Brutal Truth or Godflesh or whatever, like I just feel like this album and the ideas of this album unspool and stretch out in all of these different directions. And you have Under the House, that is Martin Atkins on drums. It could be nobody else. God bless John and Keith for the cool percussion parts that they do and the weird off-kilter rhythms of Flowers of Romance. Love it, but god damn it, only Martin Atkins is going to play it like this. And so what Keith talked about with the recording of this song was that, like feeding, I forget which Shakespeare play it is, but is it King Lear? Like feeding that into feeding the BBC line into the mixing of I Am the Walrus. They fed in whatever was on television, and that is where you get the weird, creepy sounds for Under the House. But also, it apparently was Nick Launay's idea to have the clappers playing, which again I read somewhere along the line that was in fact pool balls or snooker balls like clacking, but no, it is the castanets. It is in fact castanets. And Nick Launay did clarify that what they used off of the television was in fact an opera, and they just recorded it randomly. So they amassed, and I mean, Martin Atkins gives the drum performance of a lifetime. That is an absolutely incredible, incredible drum performance that then is, built up and manipulated. And that's part of the genius of what they were doing is if you didn't have somebody as awesome as Martin Atkins, you wouldn't be able to make it sound that cool artificially, right? So it takes the talent of a Martin Atkins, and then it takes the talent of people like Keith Levine and Nick Launay to like really seize upon that and move that. Then you have Lydon's vocal. First of all, the lyrics. So part of the reason they wound up at the townhouse was John was convinced that the manor was haunted, and he claimed to have seen a ghost and seen several other supernatural things that were happening in the original plastic box. He does humorously also note, he also puts in, please note, I drink very heavily. but as a half Irish English person myself, so the household that I grew up in, and I've talked about my father, my extremely conservative father before, Well, my dad had all sorts of ghost sightings as a child, and some that appeared to be pretty real. And he then got, when he was in college, got very into doing seances and palm readings. And he was very, very accurate with it. And he had some strange encounters that a priest advised him to not touch those areas any longer, that he was potentially out of his depth and he was too good at connecting with whatever else is out there in the world. And beyond our ability to see, my father put a lot of effort in his life into getting me to not get into that stuff. That being said, without ever having tried, I have had a number of very, very strange experiences myself. And so I grew up in a world where that stuff, if I'm not going to definitively say is real, I'm going to say certainly had the strong possibility of being real, or certainly seeming real. And boy, what a strange set of coincidences. There have been a number of them. And so, I always took my dad's advice on that one. The idea, because I have seen people who have crossed over and gone into those things, and what I have come away with is that stuff is much stronger than you are, and it will kick your fucking ass, and you don't want what's coming with it. And that is kind of how I live my life with that stuff. So I don't screw with those things as a basic policy, right? And I don't know what John's thoughts are, but he did write Under the House. It is one of the great evocations of supernatural fear ever recorded. It is another masterful set of lyrics, and the treatment, his vocal performance, without trying to sound scary, is fucking scary. It is fucking terrifying. But the submerged, shuddering, echoing, vibrating treatment on the vocals is absolutely incredible. And then the cuts where it goes into the castanets, amazing. Another masterpiece on an album full of masterpieces. And it's so interesting how these are all slightly different approaches, and yet it all becomes this unified group of sounds, colors, emotions, experiences. This is, again, to use the phrase I've used a lot, this is why they, even without wobble, even with, they are still, god damn it, the governors of post-punk, for whatever that is even still, whatever that still even means by 1981. But at any rate, we will now flip the record over. We get to side 2 of this incredible album, and it opens up with Jaime's Hymn. Finally, we're going to finally talk about Jaime's Hymn. So the one piece of music for Wolfen to continue to exist, and the one thing on this album actually done at the Manor. And the instrument that is played on Jaime's Hymn is called an angklung. It is not, in fact, bagpipes. The angklung was also used on Pied Piper. I guess, is that? And it was given by, the angklung was given to Keith Levene by Richard Branson. Richard Branson picked it up on a trip to Bali. How interesting is that? Jaime's Hymn is a beautiful, spectral instrumental that is very much of a piece with both elements of Pied Piper as well as, of course, Phonogen. And you can, that is a wholly unique sound that Public Image Ltd. Picked up, used, utilized to its sort of full potential, or what? Well, maybe is it its full potential? Maybe not. Maybe they could have kept going down that road. But my goodness, it certainly is. It certainly is fascinating and really, really beautiful and really, really idiosyncratic. But I would assume that's Levine on synths. Probably the most conventional synth work other than Radio 4 that he ever did. Jaime's Hymn seemed to kind of be his baby. Absolutely love it. It fits in the atmosphere of this album perfectly. Though I do feel like you can tell it is different than the Townhouse, if that makes any sense. But Absolutely love it. It's a perfect side opener to the album, a perfect, again, another perfect piece of connective tissue. Speaking of connective tissue, we get into the next song, which is "Banging the Door," and it reminds me that I've neglected to mention something about Phonogen. We'll connect this back to "Banging the Door" in a second. Keith doesn't play that much guitar on this album, and the backwards guitar symphony that sort of explodes, or not even explodes, implodes out in the middle of Phonogen is another absolutely stunning piece of sound painting. That is the sound of the dirt, the close-up of the dirt and the bugs in Blue Velvet. My God, that is it. That is again eerie and otherworldly. What a miraculous little piece of music in a larger piece of music. That is absolutely incredible. But part of why I say that is what Keith does on guitar, he manages to do on the next song, "Banging the Door," with endless layers of synthesizer overdubs. And that apparently was built up just track by track by track by track, laboriously. And again, we have, though, Four Enclosed Walls is the big star of the Martin Atkins drum performances. Is "Banging the Door" his actual greatest? Ooh, it might be. The way he turns the beat around, the way he's playing sort of on top of the beat, that is absolutely incredible, and that is 10 times better than any of the sort of proto-hip-hop backing track stuff that bands messed around with in the 90s. I mean, Martin creates it and perfects it in one fell swoop and does it better than anybody else did it, I think. There's just so much music that wouldn't be possible without this. A lot of Bjork stuff wouldn't be possible without this album. This is such an unbelievable, forward-thinking piece of work. And "Banging the Door," again, speaking of connective tissue, this is the real world version of the whatever you could say, Under the House could be a theoretical version, but "Banging the Door" could be the real life version, possibly inspired by Victor Vomit from Hull, whoever ye may be, Victor Vomit, I don't know. But "Banging the Door," another sort of proto hip hop chanting, circular, repetitive lyric. This is a paranoid, angry performance from a man who had lots and lots of reasons. I mean, he was out on bail at this point, lest we forget. Who had a lot of reasons to be paranoid and angry. And the police raids, and again, literally being out on bail, the people banging the door, incredible. And John turns this into an absolutely phenomenal piece of angular, clipped, circular songwriting. Brilliant. But also what they do with what Martin Atkins does and what Keith does and the atmosphere that they create. Again, this is another perfect compliment. It's almost as if Under the House and Banging the Door are almost like a single hidden away within inside of this album, that they are A-side, B-sides of each other. But again, what is this genre exactly? Some sort of proto-industrial, proto-hip-hop, proto-golden age of hip-hop. They went into some fascinating area here. The next level of psychedelia, the next level of the Berlin Trilogy, the next level of treating the studio like the instrument. Absolutely phenomenal. Also, Nick Launay shares the very funny story that the wind back Nick is because John had run out of lyrics on that vocal take and did another vocal take where he finished the lyrics, but they kept that. The thing that Nick Launay mentioned is that a lot of the songs on here were actually rough mixes because they were working quickly and they just used the rough mixes, which I think also kind of perfectly fits in with with the general vibe of this album. Also, Keith apparently is playing a Roland synthesizer, for those of you who care about those sorts of things. Now, the next song is another one that is another piece of connective tissue, and that is Go Back. The first thing I will say is Keith's guitar makes its most characteristic appearance here, and yet it is also its most satisfying, perhaps. But it ties together the sound generation that he does on Phenogen. It ties together the weird chock-a-block, almost funk of track 8, or inside out funk of track 8. But this is with Keith's hyper needling, abrasive, melting glass style, and it's really satisfying to hear it towards the end of the album. Also, speaking of Keith, as Keith had, I don't know if this was deliberate on his part, but as he mimicked Wobble for the bass line of Radio 4, this is him doing a hell of a Martin Atkins impression. He even turns the beat around the way Martin does. And so it's also, this is the best drumming that Keith ever did on a Public Image Ltd record. His drumming, and again, like For Enclosed Walls, like these are like ultimate drum sounds. Like these are some of the best goddamn drum sounds. Nick Launay is a fucking genius, but again, it also takes the genius of, somebody like a Martin Atkins, or in this case a Keith, to do stuff this cool and this awesome with it, right? So that drum beat, another proto hip hop, like this is the sound of Boogie Down Productions. This is the sound of Eric B. and Rakim. This is the sound of the first Wu-Tang album. Before Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five were even cutting records, right? Like, it's just so wild how far afield this this music is. And again, bands using treated drums like the John Spencer Blues Explosion, like the Boredoms, like, well, a lot of Japanese noise stuff. Like, this is way the hell far afield. That drum beat, that weird off-kilter funk, and again, the way this album, as I've been talking about in terms of connective tissue, the way that this album all weirdly ties together, and yet they're all singular approaches within this larger whole of a work. What an extraordinary body of work! And then you have, talk about clipped, circular, angular lyrics. John, again, proto-rapping, delivers a hell of a State of the Union address on England and Thatcherite / United Front England. It's incredible. It is such a, and without getting into being didactic, without tying himself into any theories, without particularly aligning himself with anything other than fucking reality and common sense, Lydon observes the problem and correctly mocks it, pillories it, satirizes it. It's perfectly done. And what a great vocal performance. What a great, again, parody of the, what's the Rivers of Blood guy? I forget his name now, but like that way of talking, the self-consciously upper crust version of the British accent, incredible. Just a absolutely masterful little song. So Banging the Door is another masterpiece on an album full of masterpieces. Go Back, goddammit, I'm going to say that too, is another masterpiece on an album full of masterpieces. It's an incredible piece of music. And then the album reaches its shuddering conclusion. There's been a lot of shuddering between Under the House and Banging the Door and Phenogen and For Enclosed Walls. There's been a lot of that on this album. A lot of backward sounds, a lot of strange, eerie, creepy stuff. But then the album kind of gets thrown into full chaotic relief. The album, in a really weird way, cracks a smile, even though it might be something more of a mad cackle. And that's, of course, the final song, Francis Massacre. Now, Lydon references Mountjoy and is yelling Mountjoy is fine among the ever-increasing demented nature of the music. I would imagine this is all just him and Keith making this ungodly, incredible, wonderful racket. As somebody who loves freakouts, this is one of the great freakouts. Lydon, I believe it's the Chris Needs interview for Zigzag, talks about that this song was specifically inspired by somebody who he met at Mountjoy. So he was in Mountjoy for, I forget, like 2 or 3 nights or something, and met somebody who, because of the situation of his case, had never spoken to his lawyer, was not allowed any communication whatsoever with the outside world. Lydon attempted, I guess, to help him or pass on his solicitor's name. I don't know what the outcome of any of that was, if anything, but that this song, he said that being in Mountjoy was nothing but grating noises. So this was the sort of the sum total of his experiences in Mountjoy, and yeah, it's a, you need some sort of, I think the album sort of, not deliberately or self-consciously or whatever, but the album sort of breaks the fourth wall, I suppose, where it just, you know, if this was a movie, it would be like the end of Tu Va Bien, where they just, you know, the whole thing is in the television studio or the film lot, and then they just go outside and they're just driving around manically outside. It's kind of like that. This is just this mad spree, and whereas most of this album, there's humor in there, but it's some of it is very pointed, but where this is largely a very serious, extremely dark, extremely dour album, this just goes completely manic, and all over the city go ape crazy, to reference Bow Wow Wow. Foreshadowing. So anyway, so that is, but I think you need that relief. I think it's okay that the album doesn't go out on some sort of major statement and just embraces its own sense of chaos, and just kicks it all out into shards. I think it's the anti-logic of that is the perfect logical ending to this album, and I absolutely love this album. It is yet another masterpiece. Yes, I'm saying it. 3 in a row. 3 masterpieces in a row. That is what Public Image Ltd. We're doing at this point. So the outtakes from The Flowers of Romance, a few of them pop up on here on the songs from the Heartbox set. I don't know what is going on with the version of this on YouTube, but of the 61 tracks, it's not the visual components, of course, but it skips around all over the place. So it's like there's, I guess, region blocking. I have no idea. At any rate, excuse me. The first of which is a song that I guess was a backing track called Wood Nymphs that Nick Launay and I guess Martin Atkins worked on. I'm not really sure. But Wood Nymphs, John in particular hated and said that it sounded like it was gay disco music. So no one has ever heard Wood Nymphs. Who knows? It was recorded, so who knows? There is the alternate mix of Under the House, which is incredible. If you love the spectral, otherworldly musical sense of Public Image Ltd, and you very much appreciate the aesthetics of this album, and you really like Pied Piper, go seek out the Under the House alternate mix. It's far less song-oriented. I think for the sake of the song, they made the right choice for the album. But, you know, if you want some more freak out and some more, you know, phantasmagoria, dark psychedelic stuff, the Under the House remix is for you. Then there's the song that wound up being, well, let's start that over, shall we, Rich? Let's get that right. And then we have, of course, the song 1981, recorded, you know, in 1980, which makes sense about the year to come. And it's kind of I think psychologically makes a lot of sense that Lydon would have written this while he's out on bail. And is oddly, I don't know, sort of prescient, or give yourself a gift to the future for somebody who's usually so totally pessimistic about things. But the production on this original version of 1981 is absolutely incredible. Martin Atkins, again, amazing. It is amazing. As a backing track, the weird smattering of what sounds like backward horns, it's absolutely incredible, and it has the drum sound that from Mount Olympus that you just can't touch. As a song, however, I think this is the weakest song Public Image had ever recorded up to this point, I'm gonna say. It's okay. It's interesting as something of a proto "This Is Not a Love Song," somewhat similar sentiment perhaps, but it's just like it was absolutely right not for it to not be on the album. But you know what really wouldn't have made sense is re-recording it completely 3 years later. I mean, that would be crazy. Who would do such a thing? That doesn't make any damn sense, does it? And then we have Vampire. Yeah, Vampire. And Vampire was a song I had heard mentioned in interviews and stuff for years, and there were thoughts that it wasn't even, the tape of it didn't even exist anymore. But no, Vampire is on here. When I saw the track listing for this thing, I think I even said, are you like fucking kidding me? Vampire is on this. Unbelievable. Vampire is another really cool instrumental. It's very much in the realm of Under the House and Banging the Door and Go Back. It is less developed as an instrumental than Jaime's Hymn. The second half of it, where it starts getting dark and freaky, is really, really cool. Maybe it could have fit the album, perhaps. I don't know. It would have been a great B-side. We'll put it that way. It would have been a hell of a B-side. I can picture if there had been a second single from Flowers of Romance. I don't know what in God's name you would pick as a second single off this album. Let's say there was. I could see, or if they had done a standalone single or something like that, I could see Vampire being a magnificent curiosity little B-side kind of thing. So that's basically it for the outtakes. The thing I did want to touch upon, again, is Nick Launay and the work that he got basically off of this album. So he goes in and does What's This For by Killing Joke. He does the To Hell With Poverty single by the Gang of Four. And then Release the Bats by The Birthday Party. And then he does the Earthbeat / the Return of the Giant Slits album. And then, so he has pretty steady work after this. And then he continues to work with Killing Joke and The Birthday Party. But also what was interesting was apparently, so he had worked under Hugh Padgham, who had done the Peter Gabriel solo records, right? And apparently, and this has been talked about before, I guess Phil Collins was in and around at this time, and wanted to talk to Nick about what it was like to work with Johnny Rotten, who was slagging him off in the press all the time. And apparently, Phil Collins paid extra close attention to the drum sound that Hugh Padgham and Nick Launay were created and mastered between the two of them. So, although Hugh Padgham, boy, he took it all too far later on in the 80s, didn't he? So, as somebody who lived through that decade. But it is funny, but the album that kind of has the most, the birth was birthed the most from the Flowers of Romance and Nick Launay worked on, is one of my favorite albums of all time, and they have a beautiful mutual admiration society between the two of them, between John Lydon and Kate Bush, The Dreaming. So this is the album that birthed The Dreaming in a lot of ways, and I think you can listen to those two albums back to back and see a certain amount of similarities. For all of the hand-wringing on the part of Virgin, that the album was uncommercial, it did reach number 11 in England, and people who were particularly unimaginative grabbed some of the more superficial aspects of their iconography and artwork and were trying to compare them to what Adam and the Ants and Bow Wow Wow were doing, which is pretty funny. And Pill roundly rejected those comparisons, as one would imagine. And the one other thing I will note when I was evoking the Beatles previously, in the Perfect Sound Forever interview, in terms of, again, using sonic exploration, using the studio as an instrument, Keith Levine did say that he felt that album was their Sgt. Pepper, which I think is very interesting. What a hell of a long month! Let's move on to May. All right, so somewhere towards the end of April, beginning of May, Keith Levine goes on holiday to New York. And, excuse me, after doing their press run, gets to New York, starts going to different nightclubs, and basically decides that he's just moving to New York, in effect. And so Levine gets connected with a woman by the name of Lisa Yap, who apparently wound up years later being a producer for CNN. Lisa Yap has a YouTube that's really interesting. I don't think it's been updated in a long time, but so Lisa Yap was a forerunner on cable access in New York, which was a big thing at the time. And she basically did a show that chronicled kind of the subterranean club scene, but the cable access being a big thing in New York at the time. You had the Glenn O'Brien show, which was really, really cool, and you can see a post-Pistol Sid and Nancy being interviewed, and there's stuff with Mick Jones and Chris Stein from Blondie. Really, really, really cool. I forget the name of Glenn O'Brien's show. He was a Warhol person. But I had a glimpse into that world as a young child from, I don't know if anybody would know who this guy is, Ugly George. Does anyone know who Ugly George is? Ugly George, this was the documentary they made about him called The Boob Tube. Ugly George was a prolific cable accessor who I found out about when I would have been maybe like 7 years old, because my dad used to periodically, we were the only house that I knew of that had cable at that point, and my dad used to periodically tape stuff off the Playboy channel, and I saw some of it. So anyway, as you do. So Ugly George basically would have a show where he had this ridiculous camera pack set up attached to himself, and he would interview women on the streets of New York and try to hit on them, and then it was, that portion of the show was called Hits and Misses, and then the rest of it was he would get them to go into like an alleyway or head back to his apartment and disrobe, and sometimes they would be filmed in flagrante delicto. So that was, and he was on the air for like 10 or 15 years, basically. So there was Ugly George, there was the Glenn O'Brien show, but there was also Lisa Yap. So Lisa Yap, and some of her stuff is on YouTube. I'll be linking to her channel because it's a really fascinating look into that world, and I only wish there was more of it. But she had a celebrity gossip show called Dirt, where they would crawl into garbage cans and be interviewed. The interview subject would be interviewed in garbage cans. Pretty wild. And I think Warhol had a cable access show too, didn't he? Wasn't that? I believe I saw that at the Warhol Museum, I dare say. So anyway, so Keith gets into this world. He gets enmeshed in this world very, very quickly. And he meets a young 18-year-old videographer named Ed Caraballo via Lisa Yap. I guess he worked on Lisa Yap's show. They start talking. They start hanging out. There is a fascinating interview on Perfect Sound Forever with Ed Caraballo. Ed Caraballo is almost like the opposite end of Nick Launay. You can kind of consider them on some sort of weird parallels of each other, or weird bookends to this strange period of time for Public Image Limited. But Ed Caraballo him and Keith like are super cool with each other really quick, and Keith doesn't really have that much to do, so he's basically hanging out at the Warner Brothers offices, and Ed just goes and hangs out with him, and they play pool at the Warner Brothers offices all day, right? And one of the funny things of the story of Wobble making off with the cash from Gunter Grove from the U.S. tour, apparently Warner Brothers did all their payments to Public Image Limited in cash, and Keith only ever had cash on him, large amounts, and was very, flagrant with it and kind of reckless. And Ed Caraballo tells the story and kept it in a brown paper bag. And Ed Caraballo tells the story that Keith was so loose with his money in this paper bag that one day he actually threw the paper bag out the car window in the Holland Tunnel, and Keith yelled and screamed at him, and Ed Caraballo had to go and gather the paper bag full of hundreds and fifties back up. The other thing that Ed notes is that Pill was renting a loft on West 18th Street, which I thought was also interesting. So I guess they did split their time between the Warner's offices and West 18th Street. So one day when they are at the Warner Brothers offices up in Rockefeller Center, they get a call from, and now here he is, Michael Alago. There is an entire documentary about Michael Alago that is really interesting that I saw at some point during the pandemic. John Lydon's in it. It's interesting. He's talking about his period in New York. It's interesting to see John in a interview situation an interview context where he's not the focus and he's talking about somebody else. It's an interesting way to hear John speak because it's always about him. So Michael Alago did promo and was a person who worked at the Ritz. And so Bow Wow Wow, I guess they were having some sort of anniversary at the Ritz, and Bow Wow Wow was supposed to play this, and Bow Wow Wow canceled. Bow Wow Wow managed the Machiavellian post-Sex Pistols project, of course, of Malcolm McLaren, right? So, ha ha ha. So, Michael Alago contacts Warner Brothers to see if there's anybody else they can get. Keith and Ed are playing pool up at Warner Brothers. They ask Keith. Keith's initial response is, fuck off. Especially given the Malcolm connection. I don't know. Now, Ed kind of claims it was sort of his idea, but who knows? And Thurston Moore notes this also in the Public Images Rotten documentary. But the thing with the Ritz is they have the largest movie screen in the Western Hemisphere. The only other movie screen of that size in the world was apparently in Tokyo, Japan. So Ed says, all this stuff that we've been talking about, we could do something really cool and really special. And, Keith is now immersed in the world of avant-garde cable access television. We could do a show. And so Keith jumps on that. Now, by this point, Keith is now really into the idea that there is no band they're not a rock band, they're not even a band. They are now just a corporation, and they make communications statements, et cetera, et cetera. So Keith really jumps on this idea and calls up Lydon, who is in England, and basically says, let's do this show. This is going to be amazing. Lydon says, are you crazy? We don't have a band. I'm not doing that. That's absolute madness. Keith says, okay, cool. I'll do the show anyway. There's no rule that says you or Jeanette have to be here. So, I'm just going to go and do this show. At which point, Lydon and Jeanette Lee fly out the day before the show on May 14th. Now, stories range on this one, but I'll just sort of combine them and say that Ed, Jeanette Lee, and Keith Levine, because I've heard versions of this where one or two or all three are involved, go to either Sam Ash Music Store or at a bar and recruit 62, well, I've seen 62 and 64-year-old drummer Sam Ulano, who was a drum instructor, and basically pay him in cash on the spot, be here, be here on the 15th, and he says basically okay, and that's it. They have a drummer for the gig. Now, Levine claims that, like Steve New and like Ken Lockey before him, Ed was an attempt to bring someone into Public Image Ltd. John again rejected this person. John didn't want to work with him. John hated him, blah, blah, blah. According to Ed, John sort of thought of Ed as Keith's guy, but was cool with him, and they later struck up a friendship later on. He claims that there was never any ill will between him and John. So what the idea that Keith had, and it's kind of an idea, kind of not an idea, was that it was going to be a live video gig. Which, what exactly does that mean? What is that? And I guess that at this point we can also get a little bit more into Jeanette Lee's role in all of this. Now, Jeanette Lee and Keith had dated, and I don't know what the state of their relationship was by this point. I get the feeling it may not have been very good by this point. Also, Ed Caraballo notes that John and Keith had really started having arguments at this point, and that there was definitely a fracturing of their relationship. Because the one thing that is interesting to note is, even in the press for Flowers of Romance when they were still back in England, is the three of them are still very much a united front, and that apparently was fraying very quickly. So Jeanette Lee's role, according to Keith, was that she was going to be the film and video person, and that he was very, very frustrated and irritated with her because she hadn't done enough, to facilitate things. And that him doing this video show was a way of kind of calling her bluff / Leiden's bluff by extension, because I guess Leiden's loyalties were some sort of pointing to her. I don't really know. And that, Keith kept saying, I've gotten more done in 2 weeks than we have gotten done in the past year, right? So, when asked if Pill had actually, what they had prepared for the show, this was his answer. We were prepared for the gig. We had interviews shot, so that would be the interviews with Lisa Yap. We had stuff shot in London, and some stuff that was shot by Dave Crow. Maybe a little footage that Jeanette had scripted, and I had shot just to check it out. Then I shot some more stuff in New York, trying to get John and Jeanette over to make more pre-production. As far as pre-production goes, according to Ed Caraballo, John basically didn't leave his hotel room, and the only thing that he participated in as far as pre-production goes was being filmed watching cable television and becoming obsessed with it, which sounds like John. But also, the other footage that they had shot were, and I guess this would be sans John, so I guess Keith and Jeanette, flying around in helicopters over New York. So, but that's about it as far as specifics. There's not much to go off of. I will say there is a shot in the Public Image's Rotten documentary, though that I would assume that's maybe stock footage, that is a sort of a flight, bird's eye view of buildings and stuff, the skyline, and it's Super 8 looking. Is that perhaps footage that was shot for that? Who knows? Just me and speculation. The other thing that I find curious that Keith notes is that they had somebody named Ariel doing art direction I don't know who Ariel is, and I've never heard any other mention of Ariel other than this one-time mention in one interview. So if anybody knows who the hell Ariel is, I would be really, really fascinated to find out more about her. Also, according to Keith, he tried to get Jeanette to film more footage while in New York, and apparently, according to him, mostly what she did was walk around and film the ground and her shoes. Again, I don't know. I've never seen any of this. I have absolutely no idea. One other thing I will say about Jeanette, though, is I do think that she was a really, really fascinating figure, and she is still, like, very highly mysterious. I follow her on Instagram, and I still find her very mysterious. The other thing I will say about Jeanette Lee, and this photo sort of does her justice, but when you see other photos of her, one of the things that people always say about her is that every person had a crush on her. And I think that there are certain girls in certain scenes that are like that are just like magnets, and guys sort of can't help themselves but have a crush on her. And I have to say, as when I was like 22 or 23, when I first started seeing pictures of her, I had a crush on her too. Like, I was like, oh my god, that's like the ultimate like indie girl, the ultimate punk rock girl. Like, she's the top of the mountain of that. So I had this like weird decades, like from a distance, decades away crush on Jeanette Lee. But like, her taste level is remarkable. And like I said, you follow her on Instagram and like you look at the photos that she takes and the stuff that she thinks to take photos of, right? She's just one of those people. Like, she's kind of endlessly enigmatic and fascinating to me. So like, I don't really know anything about her, but from a very long distance, I like Jeanette very much. So according to Ed Caraballo, the Ritz offered $8,000 for 2 performances. For whatever reason, he got gutsy and said, that's nowhere near enough. We need $12,000. And they capitulated and said, okay. The guys who ran the Ritz apparently had something of kind of a mafia vibe. Keith seemed to think that they were very connected. Who knows? New York City nightlife at that time is certainly not outside the realm of possibilities. The tickets for both shows basically sold out instantly. The second that Alago had gotten the sign-off from Pill, the tickets sold out, right away. They were billing it, though, as basically as a concert, not that it was like some sort of avant-garde performance art thing. And I want to say, one of the posters I saw, it's been a while since I've seen it, I think it might have even said featuring Johnny Rotten, formerly of the Sex Pistols. Like, it was totally, and as a couple other people have noted, I think Ed Caraballo as well, that it was sold to what is called the Bridge and Tunnel crowd. So like people coming in from Jersey and stuff, right? They sort of set up shop at the Ritz. And one of the things that they discovered in the basement to go along with the gigantic white movie screen is they discovered this massive white tarp. And Ed and Keith decide to cover the stage and the back wall as much as they can with this giant white tarp so that everything is just stark white when people come in, and that will be, visually striking, which it of course is. Interviewed before the show by, and this will come up in a few minutes, Jeanette Lee, who was sitting up in the video booth, says, it wasn't supposed to be advertised as playing. There are instruments up there, and we will be up there, but there will be no playing. If you had told us a week ago that we would be doing this, we wouldn't have believed you. We weren't even positive we were actually going to go through with this until 9 o'clock this morning. We still don't know what we're going to do when we get up there. Ho, ho, ho. So with that, there are a couple interesting gig reviews on fodderstomp.com. And so basically, people got to the venue around 4 p.m. and stood in the rain for about 5 or 6 hours. They started letting people in around 10 p.m., and the band didn't go on until around 1. The other thing to note is that it was pouring down rain all day. So these people stood around for 5 or 6 hours trying to get in, hoping soon to get in. And they were wet, cold, and angry. And so they're just in the Ritz. And again, it's another few hours before the show even starts. So what finally happens when the show begins is Lisa Yap is brought out on stage in a garbage can and emerges from the garbage can and introduces the band. Apparently it was going to be a longer segment, but people had already started yelling at her and throwing things. So she just said, like, basically, here's Public Image Ltd. They also show interview footage that was filmed that I guess Keith was on Dirt. So they show that. So Keith is saying rock and roll is dead. We're in a new age, and sort of making these pronouncements. Again, the band hasn't really started yet, and the show hasn't really started. People are just sort of watching this and are confused as to what is even really happening. With that, eventually the show actually begins, and apparently, so much to my incredible frustration, there has never, the footage from this has never come out. Apparently all of it was filmed. So somewhere, theoretically, this all exists. All we have are a few photos and a couple really wonky sounding audience recordings, which one of which I will be linking to. I have downloaded a couple versions of this different bootleg versions of this over the years. One was sped up to fit on a 45 record or something. Like, I don't really get what the hell was happening with some of that stuff. So I've gone down a couple blind alleys over the years trying to find stuff. There was what could be footage in the Public Image's Rotten documentary, but that also could be really grainy Super 8 footage of goddamn near anything. I mean, I've seen better footage of Bigfoot, basically. So I'm not really sure what that footage even was. But basically, they were projecting stuff onto the screen. They would... Oh, and that's the other thing. They had these massive, like, lights that would shine on the band, thus shooting out these massive silhouettes. And at first, people were very entranced by it. And Ed Caraballo sort of posits the theory that they thought that this was their introduction, their entrance, like what a grand entrance. And they didn't realize that, no, this was actually just the show. So basically, what they had up there was a turntable, and Keith, somebody who could see around the scrim, basically says they saw Keith put the record on and play the song Flowers of Romance. So there's the recorded version of Flowers of Romance. I always thought it sounded like Samu Lana was playing along with it. I can't really be sure. There is a pretty cool instrumental jam with Keith doing some cool guitar stuff. There is a version of Four Enclosed Walls. There's A Hole in My Heart, which is John, you know. There is sort of a version of Go Back, you know. Then another break, and then another version of Go Back, and then John singing and taunting the audience. That's, in effect, if you will, the quote-unquote set list. But the taunting really begins. John, you know, live at Chelmsford Top Security Prison, that live album where John is, like, taunting the prisoners, and this is, like, early 76 Pistols. That's something to behold. That's pretty wild and pretty fucking gutsy. This is on a whole other level, because the crowd is surly and upset and screaming. And John doesn't back off in terms of taunting them and, like, making fun of them. It just sort of doesn't stop, right? So, as Keith said, he picks up on things I don't even think about. He picked up on the straightforward thing that that we didn't have an art crowd there. It was the bridge and tunnel crowd. He sussed out the demographic of the audience, so he started playing whatever would piss them off just to get a response. Apparently, one of the versions of Go Back that they played, so they play it 2 times. Apparently, one of them has Keith on drums and Sam Mulano is not on drums. I am not sure exactly at what point in the show this happened. It would have been towards the end. But, so people were screaming, raise the screen, raise the screen. Eventually, Ed Caraballo was it was really like yelled at that he had to raise the screen, and what happened was, so he raises the screen, the lights are behind the screen and blind the audience, so everybody sort of goes back, like that temporarily stops the riot, right? But what they started doing was pulling on the tarp, and that is where things really go haywire, because they're all pulling on the tarp and everything is moving. So like the drum set moves forward, like the amps are moving forward. And that's where things get really dangerous. Keith gets off a great one-liner. He says at one point, if you just destroy that screen, we will destroy you. And also, Keith appears to mean it. There is what looks to be a photo of Keith doing this to the crowd, like he comes out. And a couple people have noted this, that he comes out and he's like knuckled up, and a bouncer, so that's a still photo, but a couple people have noted that a bouncer came around and picked him up and took him off, and a bottle missed his head by inches. Apparently, Keith was the only one who ever came out from behind the screen. Jeanette got the hell out of there. Sam got the hell out of there. Once they started yanking the tarp, Lydon was out of there, and apparently then building management come on, and but bottles were being thrown, and apparently after that night, the Ritz never served, only ever served beer in plastic cups ever again. One person in the audience noted, I did get a look of John right in the eye, and my first thought was, this guy is scared to death. So that, and probably was. One kid apparently did actually get hit in the head with a bottle and was bleeding. They had brought him backstage, or maybe there were 2. And Keith, John, and Jeanette are backstage laughing. This is John's era where he started wearing those weird, the pants he first wore on Top of the Pops. But this like pilot's outfit, I don't really understand what it is. It's a strange ensemble, and its variations are strange. Though, starting the previous year on the U.S. tour was the beginning of John wearing U.S. sports gear, specifically baseball jerseys. And John appears to be wearing a New York Yankees jersey. Keith is in a whole sort of new getup. Keith is in almost like a zoot suit with a bowler hat. So Keith has like a whole, and like newly shorn hair. So Keith is in sort of like a new visual vibe, I guess, if you want to call it that. And the photos from backstage, like they're all having a great time. Like they're laughing. The kid has like an ice pack or whatever on his head. He's having a great time. There was apparently another punk rock kid who like couldn't believe his luck. They were worried management of the Ritz were worried he was going to sue. This kid was like never going to sue. He was having the best night ever. And eventually the crowd did get out safely, though it easily could have gone sideways. Needless to say, the show for the next night was very swiftly canceled. The concert is chronicled in very detailed fashion by Tim Somers. He's the one who interviewed Jeanette. He gives the most detailed account. It's really interesting. I'll, of course, be linking to that. But Tim Somers, for those of you who may or may not remember, was something of a mainstay of MTV, and he was the backup for Kurt Loder on MTV News for a while in the late 80s. So I always forget that he had been a music journalist before that, and I think he became a music journalist again. But Tim Somers was like, I think, was he like an early host or something of like the early versions of Unplugged? Like, he was, there was always a like a taste level and a tastefulness to Tim Somers. So but he wrote the most detailed account. And yeah, rumor has it he also was responsible for Hootie and the Blowfish being signed to Atlantic Records. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's kind of funny to think about. And then the other account of this show that is really interesting, though she uses it as a launching off point to talk about what it's like for bands and venue and trying to make it through the labyrinth of venues in New York at the time. But very interesting, published in art form in January of 1983, the essay "I'm Really Scared When I Kill in My Dreams" by Kim Gordon. So Kim and Thurston were actually at the Ritz Riot. 3 days after the riot, on May 18th, Public Image Ltd. had a press conference in the Warner Brothers conference room, and according to both Keith and Ed, they actually filmed the press. Keith saying that he was carrying a camera as if it were a gun, and all of this was videoed, and Ed wanted to cut all of this footage together. Keith started getting very paranoid that he was going to somehow rip Pill off, and Levine and Ed all of a sudden were on the outs, so with each other. And that was an unfortunate product of Keith's paranoia. Ed's idea was that they could sell it as a home video release, and it could be really cool, and they could really like cut things together in a provocative, interesting way. But unfortunately, that came to nothing. Like so much. So by the end of May, Ed Caraballo is out. I forget what the story was. He wound up being captured by ISIS, or no, Al Qaeda or something. He was like detained. I forget where. He eventually got out. He has a very small YouTube channel now, and I've seen him pop up in different things. But yeah, but he apparently, the Second Iraq War was apparently a pretty horrendous experience for him. At the end of May, Keith does an interview with Billboard and claims, and this is interesting, that Pill has created 3 video pieces, 2 showing it as a band in performance, and 1 titled Borg Sea Orifice shows Lydon playing the part of Borg and being interviewed on tape. Levine is currently working at ex-Utopia member Moogie Klingman's audio-video High Five Studio in New York on a project for cable TV. Very, very, very interesting. Between May 28th and June 13th, The Clash perform at Bonds International Casino. We all know about the Clash Bonds shows, right? So, the Clash are, in the state that they're in. And it's interesting. The Clash sort of shed themselves of the marathon statement of Sandinista and jump into the, We Are Radio Clash, right? Like it's very interesting that the Clash sort of move away from Sandinista very quickly. And in a similar way, Pill, though they aren't being terribly productive, move away from the darkness, and I would even go so far as to say as Englishness of Flowers of Romance. Flowers of Romance seems to now already kind of be a distant memory. So somewhere in there, Keith attends 3 of the shows at Bonds with his new best buddy, Robert De Niro. And I once knew a woman who was going to be interviewing Robert De Niro, and she knew what a big fan I was, we would like me to ask him. And I was like, ask him, like, what the hell he was, like, doing being friends with Keith Levine. That's fucking amazing. Tell me everything. And apparently she didn't get a chance to interview him. It got canceled, like, 2 days before. So I never got to find out. Anyway, But somewhere in here, and there are two different cuts of this on YouTube, but I'm going to link to the longer one, which includes the footage of the other one. Keith Levene pops up on another cable access show, Manhattan Alley. Super experimental, amazing video work. It's so cool. I love the editing. I love the style. It's way out there. It's visually beautiful. If you are into that sort of thing, I can see some people might not be into it, but fuck that. It's awesome. And it's really interesting. But Keith it's post Ritz Riot, but Keith kind of goes the usual party line, if you will, for Pill at the time. But yeah, so Keith was really not into the clash at Bonds. He was unamused. Also, around this time, Keith approaches Bob Tulipan to basically be something of a manager for Pill and to get them U.S. visas. So Tulipan is a concert promoter. He had worked with a lot of different punk and like new wave bands. And this kind of begins an association that is going to figure prominently into '82. And Bob Tulipan was one of the people who I'm really glad that they interviewed for the Public Image Ltd. Documentary, because that is such a mystifying period. I feel like any kind of anything is helpful during that time. John Lydon does an interview with the punk zine Flipside, for anybody who remembers Flipside. So in it, among other things, is Stacy Green is now a member of Public Image Ltd. Says Stacy Green, she had been a Warner Brothers employee. When I first met them, I was scared. I'm not really in tune with that kind of stuff, but they're really great guys. So is Jeanette. I was leaving Warner's anyway at that point, but it just worked out well. There's probably some sort of message there. So your guess is as good as mine. I do not have the slightest idea. We'll say it's September. Who knows about anything during this period? But apparently, given that it topped out at about 114 on the charts, Public Image Ltd. excuse me, and Warner Brothers decide mutually to end their contract right somewhere around this time. Another Flipside interview, except this time the interview was actually with Keith Levene back from the U.S. tour in 1980. It took a long time for it to get printed. And the interview is conducted by, oh, here we go, Bill Bartell, otherwise known as Pat Fear. You remember Pat Fear, name-checked in the Sonic Youth song Screaming Skull? Pat Fear of the great punk parody band, but also they did lots of other stuff that was non-parodic in nature. White Flag, fucking fantastic band, and soon to be the subject, The Secret Lives of Bill Bartell, coming soon from the man who brought you The Year Punk Broke, Dave Markey. So Bill Bartell, I am following that on Instagram. I can't wait to see that goddamn thing. Bill Bartell that is a wild story, and I truly cannot wait to see that. So, but it wasn't. So the idea of Bill Bartell interviewing Keith Levene is fucking nuts. But it gets more nuts, especially because he was long dead by the time this actually came out. Darby Crash, yes, Darby fucking Crash of like major Rich Talk Records favorites, the Germs, who will be the subject of videos like at some point. I might do Flipper this year and the Germs next year. I haven't quite worked that out yet exactly how I want to do that. But yeah. So the Germs, so Darby fucking Crash, who covered the song Public Image at the last ever Germs show. That Darby Crash, right? Unbelievable. Darby Crash and Bill Bartell interviewed Keith Levene. That will make my head explode if I think about it long enough. Oh my God. To have been a fly on the wall for that. But apparently they tried to get it published in Cream and it didn't work, so they had to delay it, and they eventually published it in Flipside. three great things from this is Bill Bartell asking Keith Levene about his time in the Clash, to which Darby is shocked to find out. That was how Darby found out that Keith Levene was in the Clash. Darby is in disbelief, and it appears to turn his punk rock world upside down. The other thing is, Bill Bartell inquires about yet another chapter of the strangeness of this song. Bill Bartell, Pat, a.k.a. Pat Fear of White Flag, inquires why Pill played Belson Was a Gas at their early shows. Keith's quote, "Belson was my song. I wrote that with Sid and John. That's a Public Image song. We didn't do it because we didn't want to, but okay." So that, but then also, and I just keep finding this fascinating, because he keeps he always talks about the music he doesn't like. "I like Eno, I like Peter Hamill and ABBA. I hate the Clash. I hate the Specials." The release of Singers and Players, the War of Words album, Keith plays on Devious Woman. It's cool. There's another post-punk record that he played on during the Flowers sessions that I'm now completely blanking on, that I was also going to mention. Oh well, that's long gone. But that's also cool too. At some point, Lydon and Lee decide that they agree with Keith and that they should stay in America and have operations in New York. So that happens at some point after the Ritz riot. I don't really know when, and honestly, I don't think any of us are ever going to know. And with that about wraps things up here. Yes, kind of a sputtering finish to this epic video and this fascinating period of time in Public Image Limited. Where will they go next? What happens next? By golly, we're just going to have to wait another year to find out. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, I'm not really looking forward to talking about the 1982 and 1983 years, because nobody comes out looking too good at all of that. And the people that I talk about, yes, I think I can be critical, but I like to approach these things with love and respect. And, it's hard to, I don't want to do puff pieces, but it does get a little dicey in there. It doesn't reflect well on anybody how all of this sort of came to an end. But it will be fun to talk about some of the live shows, some of the press, and it will be fascinating to talk about the Commercial Zone album, some of which I think is incredible. And makes you wish that they had somehow pulled it together. So, but that's going to be a while. Those are really going to take a lot of time and research to try to get everything right. That's a really, really, really convoluted period. So it makes the Beatles Get Back period look pretty relatively straightforward by comparison. So, but that's about it for now. The Pill videos have been a lot of work. On top of that, I have had a really, really, really ridiculous work project that hopefully is coming to an end in the next couple days. But that has been exhausting. So working on these videos with this, so there were the two videos and there were two ends of this work project, and that has just sort of been fused together for the past few weeks for me as sort of like one big thing I'm working on. So I'm really excited to kind of get into some other stuff. I actually have a very, very, very kind of fun video that I don't have to beat myself up over and try and get everything right and cross T's and dot I's over. I can just look at the list of records and run through them really quick and have some fun, which I'm looking forward to. And then I'll get into some more ambitious stuff probably in another month or two, but otherwise, so I will be back in a couple weeks with a really fun video. I hope you enjoy it. I have picked up some more subscribers. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much. The Pill videos really get a cool audience, and I don't really know why that is, but it really is extraordinary, and I really do appreciate it every single time. It is amazing. And I just want to say there's a really cool specific Public Image Limited channel that I've been watching on and off for a little while now, certainly a couple of years, but it does guitar tutorials on Public Image Limited and has done some really good reviews of Public Image Limited. And that's Hidden Image Limited. Is a really cool channel. And post me putting out the 1980 video, the guy that runs that channel sent me a friend request on Facebook. So thank you for that. That was really cool. I love your channel, like right on. We haven't really communicated, so I'm saying it here and now. And also saying it here and now, yes, I did get somebody from across the sea, across the Atlantic Ocean, Dark Globe Pink, who explained to me what a spice bag is. So thank you, Dark Globe Pink. And Dark Globe Pink, again, really, really cool, expansive taste in music, and said one of the coolest things that I've been told about my channel, which is it's like finding life on another planet. And that is the general idea of this channel. I am not trying to be, I'm not trying to get 50 bajillion views and do TikTok dances and shit. This is, every video is just me kind of putting the little letter in the bottle and throwing it out there and seeing who finds it. And so finding life on another planet, that's kind of the general vibe of this whole thing. It's just sending it out into the universe and then seeing what happens, right? So that was a really, really cool comment, but also thank you for explaining to me what a spice bag is. You better believe I went and told my wife, you're not going to believe this. I actually got an explanation of what a spice bag is. So thank you for that. And otherwise, yeah, I hope you enjoy the next video. I believe it's going to be a hard left away from Public Image Limited. We're going into a whole different area. So, but I will be back next year with 82 and 83 and Commercial Zone and all that. So anyway, it's been a long day, so I'm gonna go crash now. But thank you for watching all of this. I will see you very soon in the next video, and until next time, bye.